In the autumn of 1348, the world did not end with a cataclysm of fire or a final battle. It ended with a smell. It was the cloying, sickly sweet scent of rotten flesh hidden beneath layers of vinegar and dried herbs, the smell of a civilization decomposing while it was still alive. Walk through the gates of a city like Florence, Paris, or London at the height of the great mortality, and the first thing you notice is the silence. The rhythmic hammer of the blacksmith has stopped. The shouting of the marketplace is gone. In its place is a heavy, stagnant quiet, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the occasional, muffled sob from behind a bolted door. Daily life has not merely changed, it has evaporated. The institutions that gave the medieval world its shape, the church, the law, the family, have buckled under the weight of the unbreed. The courts are empty because the judges are dead or have fled to the countryside. The parish priest, once the shepherd of souls, has locked his doors, refusing to hear the final confessions of the dying for fear of the air they breathe. In this vacuum of authority, the thin veneer of human custom has stripped away. We see the most sacred bonds of humanity dissolve in real time. Chroniclers tell us of mothers who abandoned their feverish children, and husbands who fled the bedside of their wives, leaving them to die in the dark. To touch the sick was to invite the ghost into your own lungs. Mercy became a death sentence, and so, mercy vanished. With the collapse of order came the death of meaning. For the medieval mind, everything happened for a reason, usually as a reflection of God's will. But as the plague tore through the cloisters of the most pious monks, while leaving the city's most notorious criminals untouched, that logic shattered. This was the era of the great disbelief. Panic took the forms, the whip and the wine. On one street, flagellants move in a rhythmic, bloody procession, beating themselves in a desperate bid for divine pity. On the next, the doors of the taverns are kicked open, as the living embrace of frantic, nihilistic hedonism. If the world is ending, they reason, let it end with a glass in hand and the law forgotten. To those trapped inside the city walls, survival feels like a cruel, nonsensical joke. There is no pattern to the scythe. It strikes the infant and the elder, the beggar and the lord. It seems to be a lottery of shadows, a chaotic storm where life and death are distributed with a terrifying, mindless randomness. But as the fires of the plague pits burn into the night, and the initial panic begins to crystallize into a cold, hard reality, a different picture starts to emerge. Beneath the carnage and the perceived chaos, the survivors begin to notice something. Death, it seems, was not as blind as it first appeared. There were invisible lines drawn through the street's fences of wealth, walls of geography, and shields of biology. The survivors were not just lucky, they were part of a new, emerging order that they didn't yet understand. The randomness was an illusion. The chaos had a structure, and in that structure lay the blueprint for a new world. The illusion of the great equalizer was a comfort to the dying, but a lie to the living. As the first wave of hysteria receded into a grim, numbing normalcy, the survivors began to look closer. They looked past the blackened swellings and the prayers, and they began to see the logic of the scythe. It became increasingly clear that while the plague was a catastrophe, it was not a chaotic one. It was an orderly executioner. It followed the veins of trade, the contours of the landscape, and, most cruelly, the hierarchies of human wealth. To understand the survival of the few, we must first deconstruct the massacre of the many. In the popular imagination, the Black Death was a shadow that fell upon the king and the peasant with equal weight. The dance macabre, the artistic motif of a skeleton leading a pope, an emperor, and a laborer to the grave, was a powerful piece of medieval propaganda designed to remind the powerful of their mortality. But on the ground, in the mud and the stone of the 14th century, the plague was a predator of the vulnerable. The first pattern was a geographical one. Death arrived in the hulls of ships, nested in the fur of black rats and the stomachs of fleas. It followed the movement of grain. Wherever humans moved in high volume, the plague moved with them. This was the geography of the grave. The ports of Messina, Genoa, and Venice were the first to fall because they were the most connected. But inside these cities, the plague did not diffuse evenly, it pooled. It settled in the low-lying districts, the areas near the docks where the air was stagnant and the filth of the city drained into the sea. If you lived near the water, if your window opened onto the alleyways where the merchants offloaded their silken bales and sacks of wheat, your probability of death was near absolute. This leads us to the second and most devastating pattern, the architecture of poverty in the 14th century. The poor did not merely live in smaller houses, they lived in communal traps, in the tenements of Paris or the crowded hovels of London's East Smithfield. The concept of a private room did not exist. Families of 8 or 10 slept on shared straw mats, their bodies pressed together for warmth. The walls were often made of wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and dung, which provided the perfect nesting ground for the rattus. These houses were not shelters, they were incubators. When a single flea jumped from a dying rat onto a sleeping child in a slum, the result was a geometric explosion of infection. Because the poor were already weakened by the Great Famine that had ravaged Europe, only decades earlier, their immune systems offered no resistance. They had spent their lives on a diet of gruel and coarse bread, their bodies stunted and their lungs scarred by the smoke of indoor peat fires. For them, the plague was not a struggle, it was a harvest. In these districts, the mortality rate didn't hover at the statistical average of 30 or 40%. In the crowded slums, it reached 90%. Entire bloodlines were extinguished in a single week, not because of a lack of faith, but because of the lack of space. In contrast, the wealthy possessed the one thing that the plague could not easily bridge: distance. The stone villas of the aristocracy, built with thick foundations and surrounded by open gardens, were naturally more resistant to the infiltration of rodents. The floors were often tiled or stone, rather than straw, offering fewer hiding places for the carriers of the disease. But more importantly, the wealthy had the luxury of choice. They could see the pattern before it reached their door. They observed that the plague moved at the speed of a walking man, and they used their resources to stay 2 weeks ahead of it. As this realization dawned on the populace, a new and terrible psychological shift occurred. The initial phase of the plague was defined by a shared, communal terror, a sense that we are all in this together. But as the patterns became visible, that communal spirit curdled into a radical, violent paranoia. People began to watch each other, not with pity, but with a cold, calculating suspicion. They noticed that the washerwomen who handled the linens of the dead died faster than the stonemasons. They noticed that the mendicant friars, who moved from house to house to comfort the sick, were being wiped out in droves. The hero became the pariah. The act of charity was redefined as a form of suicide. This led to the collapse of the duty of care. In the eyes of the survivor, the sick person was no longer a neighbor. They were a biological weapon. We see in the records of the time a total withdrawal from the public sphere. The people who survived were those who turned their backs on the suffering. This was not a moral failure in their eyes. It was the birth of a new, grim discipline. They learned that to survive, one had to be heartless. They began to monitor the movement of their neighbors. If a man was seen coughing, his entire family might be walled into their home by the rest of the street. Survival was becoming a matter of control over who you touched, where you walked, and whose air you breathed. The church, the most powerful institution of the age, provided a tragic case study in these patterns of death. The high clergy, the bishops and cardinals who resided in palatial estates often survived. They had the means to isolate, to eat well, and to limit their contact with the masses. But the lower clergy, the parish priests and the monks who lived in communal dormitories, were decimated. In some regions, the mortality rate for monks was significantly higher than for the general population. The reason was structural. They ate together, prayed together, and slept together. Their commitment to order and community became their undoing. The plague exploited their discipline. It showed that the old medieval virtues of communal life and spiritual brotherhood were now lethal liabilities. Movement, too, followed a pattern. The plague moved along the arteries of the world, the roads and the rivers. If you lived in a village that sat on a major pilgrimage route, you were doomed. If your village was tucked away in a high mountain valley or a remote marshland, you might never see a single case of the buboes. Survival was often a matter of being unconnected. The more isolated a community was from the flow of global trade, the safer it remained. This created a strange paradox. The backwards and the lonely parts of the world became the only sanctuaries of life. By the winter of 1349, the survivors were no longer those who were simply lucky. They were the ones who had adapted to the new logic of existence. They were the ones who had internalized the lesson that proximity equals death. They had seen the patterns in the slums. They had seen the failure of the monasteries, and they had seen the success of the fleeing nobles. A new social grammar was being written. It was a grammar of barriers. The first true survivors were not those who stayed to rebuild, but those who had the foresight and the cruelty to create distance. They were the ones who had realized that the only way to beat a plague that thrives on human connection is to sever those connections entirely. They began to look at the world not as a community of souls, but as a map of infection zones. As we look at the empty hearths of the poor and the abandoned cathedrals, we see the first outlines of a new strategy. It was a strategy of withdrawal. Those who survived were the ones who learned to build a wall not just of stone, but of behavior. They were the architects of the first quarantines, the pioneers of the cordon sanitaire. They had stopped asking why God was angry and started asking how far the neighbor lived. The chaos was ending. The era of the void was being replaced by the era of the filter. And as the first group of organized survivors began to retreat into the high places and the walled estates, they were not just running away. They were creating the first blueprints for a world defined by order, control, and the ruthless management of human space. The survivors were moving away from the centers of the world, seeking the safety of the void, and in doing so, they were preparing to build a new civilization from the wreckage of the old, one founded not on the presence of others, but on their calculated absence. The first survivors were the ones who left, as the realization took hold that the plague was not a passing shadow, but a permanent inhabitant of the city streets. A mass exodus began. It was a flight of the desperate, the wealthy, and the terrified, all driven by a singular, primal realization that the very foundations of medieval life, community, trade, and proximity had become the instruments of their destruction. The road, once the symbol of connection and commerce, was transformed into a lifeline for the few and a gauntlet of death for the many. This was the era of the Great Disconnection, where humanity's first successful defense against the invisible enemy was not medicine nor prayer, but the simple, brutal act of putting miles of empty air between themselves and their fellow man. For the elites of the 14th century, the strategy of escape was dictated by both means of philosophy. In the early months of the outbreak, the wealthy did not wait for the mandate of the state or the blessing of the church. They watched the mortality rates in the slums, they smelled the rising stench from the plague pits, and they understood that the urban environment had become a trap. They retreated to their country estates, their hunting lodges, and their fortified villas in the hills. We see this most famously in the hills above Florence, where groups of young nobles sought to recreate a world of beauty and refinement while the city below them burned with fever. They brought with them their servants, their musicians, and their stores of fine wine and aged meats, attempting to wall out the apocalypse with the comforts of their class. But this flight was not merely an act of physical movement. It was a radical abandonment of the social contract. To leave the city was to leave behind the starving, the sick, and the dying. It was a declaration that the survival of the individual or the family outweighed the survival of the collective. The moral cost of this escape was astronomical. The journals and letters of the time reveal a haunting sense of guilt masked by a desperate, forced gaiety. Those who fled were acutely aware that their safety was bought with the abandonment of their duties. Magistrates left their benches, priests left their altars, and doctors left their patients. The order of the medieval world was built on the idea of the body politic, where every limb had a function. By fleeing, the head of that body had effectively severed itself, leaving the rest to rot. This strategy of isolation worked, though the survivors of the time did not understand the biological mechanics of their success. To the 14th century mind, the plague was carried by miasma, corrupted air that had become heavy with the stench of decay and the influence of malignant planets. By moving to the high ground, where the winds were brisk and the air was thin, they believed they were breathing impurity. In their view, distance worked because it allowed the venomous vapors to dissipate before they could be inhaled. They did not know of fleas or bacteria, but they possessed a keen, observational logic. The further you were from the stench of the sick, the longer you lived. Biologically, this was a masterpiece of unintentional defense. By moving into the countryside, they were breaking the chain of transmission. They were moving away from the black rats that infested the grain stores of the docks. They were moving into environments where the density of human hosts was too low for the plague to sustain its geometric growth. Every mile of forest or field acted as a natural filter, a biological buffer zone that the pestilence struggled to cross. Distance was the only effective shield because it attacked the plague's greatest strength, its reliance on human intimacy. However, the countryside was not the sanctuary it appeared to be. As the urban masses saw the wealthy flee, they too attempted to take to the roads. This led to a secondary wave of chaos. Villages that had previously welcomed travelers now became xenophobic fortresses. The cordon sanitaire, the line of health, was first drawn not by governments, but by peasants with pitchforks. Communities began to seal themselves off from the outside world with a terrifying, violent discipline. Any traveler seen on the road was treated as a harbinger of doom. In the English countryside and the valleys of the Alps, villages established watches at their borders. If an outsider approached, they were met with stones, arrows, or fire. This was the birth of a new, localized sovereignty. The village was no longer a part of a kingdom, it was an island in a sea of death. The order of these isolated communities was maintained through absolute exclusion. They stopped the movement of goods, the movement of news, and the movement of people. If a member of the village was found to have had contact with an outsider, they were often cast out or quarantined in the woods, left to die of exposure or hunger rather than risk the influence entering the gates. This was survival at its most ruthless. The moral cost was the total erasure of the neighbor. The stranger was no longer a guest. He was a biological threat. The Christian virtue of hospitality, which had been a cornerstone of European life for a millennium, was discarded overnight. Inside the families that fled, the psychological trauma was even deeper. We have accounts of families who took to the woods, living in makeshift huts, only to have one member fall ill. The discipline of survival dictated a horrifying choice: stay and die together, or abandon the loved one and live. The records show that, more often than we care to admit, the living chose the latter. Parents left children by the side of the road with a crust of bread and a jug of water, fleeing into the trees as the first buboes appeared on the child's neck. This was the great betrayal of the Black Death, a shattering of the most fundamental human instincts. The survivors who emerged from these woods months later were often hollowed out, their lives saved but their souls burdened by the memory of the faces they had turned away from. Yet, as the months turned into years, it became clear that flight was a flawed strategy. The road was a two-way street. Often, the very people fleeing the plague were the ones carrying it into the pristine valleys they sought to inhabit. A single servant with a cough, a single blanket carried from a city bedroom, could turn a mountain sanctuary into a charnel house. The pattern of the road showed that the plague traveled at the speed of human desperation. Those who fled in a panic often brought the fire with them, igniting new outbreaks in the very places they thought were safe. The strategy of the flight was a gamble, and for many, the house always won. By 1350, the map of Europe was a patchwork of dead zones and silent pockets of survival. The geography of the continent had been redrawn by the instinct to hide. The great urban centers, once the pride of the Middle Ages, were becoming ghost towns, while remote, lonely places saw a strange, desperate influx of the terrified. The order of the world had been replaced by the order of the wall. Humanity had learned that the only way to survive was to stop being human, to stop touching, stop gathering, and stop caring. Isolation had saved thousands, but at the cost of the civilization they were trying to protect. The world had become a collection of fractured, paranoid cells, each waiting for the end. The survivors were those who had mastered the art of distance, who had embraced the cruelty of exclusion, and who had learned to find safety in the silence of the hills. They were the architects of a new, fragmented reality, where the highest virtue was no longer bravery or charity, but the ability to stay away. But as the smoke cleared from the burning villages and the mountain air grew cold, a new realization began to emerge from the wreckage. While the elites fled and the villages hid, something unexpected was happening in the heart of the storm. Not every city had been abandoned. Not every community had dissolved into a panicked flight. In the midst of the carnage, a few urban centers, places that should have been wiped off the map by all the logic of geography and poverty, were finding a different way. They weren't running. They were standing their ground. They were discovering that there was another path to survival, one that didn't require the abandonment of the city, but the radical reorganization of it. These were the places that would prove that while distance was a shield, it was not the only weapon humanity possessed. Beneath the chaos of the flight, the first seeds of public health and civic control were being planted, leading to a form of survival that was not based on the void, but on the most rigorous iron-fisted order the world had ever seen. While the roads of Europe were choked with the fleeing shadows of the elite, and the desperate, a different, more terrifying form of salvation was taking shape behind the high stone walls of a few select cities. If Part 3 was the story of the void of the safety found in the empty places, Part 4 is the story of the fist. Cities into fortresses of administrative iron. They realized, with a cold and sudden clarity, that if the plague moved through human contact, then the only way to save the city was to freeze it in place. The most chilling example of this occurred in Milan. Under the absolute rule of the Visconti family, Lucchino and Giovanni Milan did not pray for a miracle, it prepared for a siege. When the plague arrived at the gates of nearby cities, the Viscontis did not wait for the miasma to reach their streets. They issued a decree that redefined the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. They declared that any house where the plague appeared was no longer a home. It was a tomb. When the first 3 families in Milan were found to have the infection, the Visconti guards did not bring medicine and they did not bring priests. They brought bricks and mortar. They walled up the doors and windows of those 3 houses while the inhabitants were still inside. They entombed the sick with the healthy, the parents with the children, and the masters with the servants. The screams from behind those walls served as a grisly deterrent to the rest of the city. It was a message of radical, unyielding authority. The individual would be sacrificed without hesitation and without mercy to preserve the collective. This was not an act of cruelty in the eyes of the Visconti. It was an act of architectural hygiene. By physically sealing the infection within the stone, they prevented the leakage of death into the wider population. While Florence descended into the chaotic dance macabre, and London streets became open sewers of corpses, Milan remained a pocket of unnatural stability. The mortality rate in Milan was a fraction of its neighbors, not because its people were more pious, but because its lords were more ruthless. They replaced the fear of the plague with an even greater fear of the state. Armed patrols moved through the streets with orders to kill anyone violating the curfew. The markets were monitored by men with bared steel. Milan proved that in the face of a biological apocalypse, speed and authority mattered more than compassion. While Milan used the fist, Venice used the mind. As a maritime empire, Venice could not simply wall itself in. Its lifeblood was the sea. If Venice stopped its ships, Venice died of starvation. Therefore, the Venetian response was not one of total closure, but a total regulation. In March 1348, the Great Council of Venice appointed a special committee of 3 the Provveditori sopra la Sanità and gave them the power of gods. These men transformed the city into the world's first administrative laboratory. They realized that the plague followed the water, and so they turned the Venetian lagoon into a series of biological checkpoints. They didn't just close the port, they filtered it. They designated specific islands for the sick, specific islands for the dead, and specific islands for the suspect. This was the birth of the Public Health Council, a body of men whose sole purpose was the management of human movement. The Venetian model was one of cold, bureaucratic precision. They created a system of health passports. If a ship arrived from a suspect port, it was forbidden from docking. If it carried goods from the east, those goods were offloaded on isolated islands and exposed to the sun and the salt air. For weeks before being allowed into the city, the Venetians were the first to understand that the city was a system, and if that system was to survive, every entry point had to be guarded by an official with the power to say no. The contrast between these cities of order and the cities of hesitation was stark. In Florence, the Republic of the People struggled to impose mandates. They debated, they argued, and they relied on the voluntary cooperation of a terrified populace. The result was a mortality rate that topped 60%. In contrast, the authoritarian structures of Milan and the bureaucratic machinery of Venice created a cordon that the plague struggled to breach. The lesson was brutal. Democracy and debate were luxuries that the Black Death did not permit. The cities that survived were those that embraced the tyranny of health. Further down the Adriatic coast, the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, took this logic to its legal conclusion. In 1377, the Great Council of Ragusa passed a law that changed the course of human history. They did not just seal the city, they codified the waiting period. They decreed that anyone arriving from a plague-infested area must spend 30 days at Trentina, on the nearby island of Merkin, or in the town of Cavtat before they could enter the city. This was the first time in history that a government had used time as a weapon against disease. The leaders of Ragusa didn't know about incubation periods or viral shedding, but they had observed a pattern. If a man didn't die within a month of exposure, he was likely safe. This was the transition from the fist to the filter. They were no longer just walling people in, they were letting the disease burn itself out in a controlled environment. The enforcement of these laws was absolute. There were no exemptions for the wealthy or the titled. To break the Trentina was a capital offense. The city-state of Ragusa realized that a single breach of the wall was the same as a total collapse of the wall. This required a new kind of discipline from the citizenry, a willingness to be policed, to be searched, and to be excluded. The Order of Ragusa was a precursor to the modern state. where the government's primary duty was the biological security of its borders. As we look at these cities, Milan with its brick-tub houses, Venice with its health councils, and Ragusa with its islands of waiting, we see the emergence of a new human strategy. These were the first survivors who did not run. They stayed, they organized, and they controlled. They proved that the randomness of the plague could be defeated by the structure of the state. They replaced the dance macabre with the ledger of health. But this order came at a psychological cost that would haunt the survivors for generations. To live in a city of order was to live in a city of watchers. You watch your neighbor for a cough, you watch the horizon for a ship, you watch the guard for a sign of permission. The order of the survivors was built on the death of trust. It was a world where every human interaction was a potential crime, and every body was a potential source of treason against the state. The success of these cities created a new paradigm for the Western world. It was no longer enough to be a king or a bishop. One had to be a guardian of the gate. The cities that survived the first waves of the Black Death were the ones that had successfully turned their geography into a prison and their laws into a shield. They had replaced the chaos of the void with the iron of the grid. Yet, even these measures, the bricked-up doors and the 30-day wait, were only the beginning. As the plague continued to return in waves, the leaders of these cities realized that 30 days was not enough. The patterns of death suggested that the invisible enemy was more patient than they had imagined. They needed a tool of control that was even more radical, even more absolute. The Trentina of Ragusa was a revolutionary start, but as the 14th century drew to a close, the cities of order prepared to deploy the most powerful and controversial weapon in the history of human survival. They were about to extend the waiting period, to formalize the isolation of the sick, and to create a word that would become synonymous with both safety and suffering. They were moving from the 30 days of the Trentina to the 40 days of the quarantena. The era of the quarantine was about to begin a radical experiment in human control that would not only change how we survived the plague, but would redefine the very meaning of freedom movement and the power of the state over the human body. The first survivors had fled, the second survivors had walled themselves in, but the third generation of survivors was about to do something even more profound. They were going to put the entire world on a clock of 40 days, and they were going to use the power of the sword to make sure that clock never stopped ticking. The transition from the 30 days of the Trentina to the 40 days of the quarantena was not a medical breakthrough, it was a declaration of total war. By the late 14th century, the authorities in Venice and Ragusa had realized that the 30-day window was a permeable shield. Some infections lingered, hiding in the folds of a silk veil or the damp corners of a ship's hold, only to ignite weeks after the all-clear had been given. They needed more time. They chose 40 days, a Jornian number steeped in biblical symbolism, echoing the 40 days of the Great Flood and Christ's 40 days in the wilderness. But in the lagoons of the Adriatic, there was nothing holy about the wait. The 40 days were a cold, calculated bet against the limits of human and bacterial life. Quarantine was never intended as a form of care. It was a massive, state-sponsored operation of containment. It was the first time in history that the government treated its own citizens and its vital trade partners not as people, but as biological hazards to be processed, filtered, and, if necessary, discarded. The operation began at the water's edge in Venice. The Lazzaretto Vecchio became the world's first dedicated quarantine station. It was a narrow island, a strip of land isolated by the gray, churning waters of the lagoon, far enough from the city to prevent the miasma from drifting across, but close enough for the state to keep it under the sights of its cannons. When a ship arrived from the east, it was no longer greeted by merchants and porters. It was met by the health magistrates' armed galleys. The captain was ordered to drop anchor in the Sinfali, a designated zone of purgatory. From that moment, the ship was a prison. Every soul on board, from the wealthiest merchant to the lowliest deckhand, was forcibly removed and transported to the Lazzaretto. They were allowed to bring nothing but the clothes on their backs. Behind them, their cargo, the lifeblood of the Venetian economy, was seized by the state. This was the most invasive part of the operation. The quarantine was not just for bodies, it was for things. The health magistrates believed that the plague could cling to anything: wool, cotton, fur, feathers. Massive warehouses were built on the island where every single crate was open, every bale of cloth was unrolled, and every sack of grain was poured out. The purification process was a scene of industrial-scale paranoia. Teams of workers, their faces covered in vinegar-soaked rags, spent their days vending the goods. They hung thousands of yards of silk in the sea breeze, believing the salt air would scrub the poison away. They burned sulfur and rosemary in the warehouses, filling the air with a choking, yellow smoke that stung the eyes and scorched the throat. This was the logic of the filter. If the plague was a physical presence, it could be aired out, smoked out, or waited out. But while the goods were being purified, the humans were rotting. Life inside the Lazaretto was a psychological horror. Hundreds of people from different social classes, different nations, and different languages were crammed into stone cells. There was no privacy, and there was no escape. They were given basic rations, bread and watered wine, and told to wait. The clock reset every time a new body was found. If a man fell ill on day 39, the entire group was forced to begin their 40 days anew. This led to a state of permanent, simmering terror. People stopped sleeping, terrified that the person next to them might develop a fever in the night. To be in quarantine was to be trapped in a room with a ticking bomb, never knowing if you were the one holding it. As the practice moved from the ports into the heart of the cities, the operation became even more claustrophobic. Domestic quarantine was the urbanization of the wall. In cities like Milan and later London, the shutting up of houses became the primary tool of the health magistrates. When a single member of a household showed symptoms, the entire family was locked inside. A red cross was painted on the door with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." A watchman was stationed outside, armed with a pike, with orders to kill anyone who tried to climb out of a window or bribe their way past the gate. This was quarantine at its most intimate and most cruel. It was a death sentence for the healthy members of the family. By locking the well in with the sick, the state was essentially sacrificing the family unit to save the street. They were creating micro-containment zones where the virus could burn itself out through the entire household, ensuring that the infection ended with that family's extinction rather than spreading to the neighbors. There was no pretense of medicine here. There was only the cold mathematics of the cordon. The public reaction to these measures was one of visceral, violent resistance. The people did not see the health magistrates as saviors. They saw them as inquisitors. In the slums of the major cities, the arrival of the searchers, women hired by the state to inspect bodies for buboes, was often met with riots. Stones were thrown from rooftops. Officials were ambushed in alleyways. The fear of the plague was eclipsed by the fear of the shutting up. Families went to extraordinary lengths to hide their sick. They dressed the dead in fine clothes and sat them by windows to pretend they were still alive. They cut out buboes with kitchen knives and cauterized the wounds with hot coals, hoping to hide the evidence before the inspectors arrived. This resistance created a cycle of escalation. The more the people hid, the more brutal the state became. The health magistrates were granted summary power. They could break down doors without a warrant. They could seize property without compensation. They could relocate entire neighborhoods to pest houses, sprawling makeshift hospitals that were little more than warehouses for the dying. The order of the quarantine was maintained by the gallows. In many jurisdictions, breaking quarantine or concealing a plague case was a hanging offense. The state had decided that the survival of the structure justified the total erasure of individual liberty. Yet, as the 40-day clocks ticked in the ports and the red crosses multiplied on the city doors, a fundamental problem emerged. A city under quarantine is a city that cannot function. Someone had to move the food. Someone had to patrol the streets. Someone had to handle the thousands of bodies that were piling up in the dead houses. The operation of quarantine required a labor force that was willing to enter the very zones of death that the rest of the world was fleeing. The elites were behind their walls. The merchants were on their islands. The families were locked in their homes. But in the space between these walls and the gray zones of the infection, a new class of person was beginning to move. These were the men and women who the state deemed expendable. They were the ones forced, by either desperation or decree, to live and work inside the quarantine. They were the ones who touched the silk that no one else would touch. They were the ones who carried the bread to the locked doors. They were the ones who hauled the death carts through the midnight streets. As we look at the birth of quarantine, we see the final perfection of the order of the wall. The world was now a series of boxes, some locked from the outside, some guarded by the sea. But the boxes were not empty. Inside the most dangerous sectors of the operation, a group of survivors was emerging who did not have the luxury of distance or the protection of a stone villa. They were the corpse bearers, the searchers, and the purifiers. They were the people of the abyss, and as part 5 draws to a close, we must look at how these individuals, those who lived in constant contact with the end of the world, became the final most essential gear in the machine of human survival. They were the ones Who would lead us into the final, darkest chapter of the plague, the era of the professionals of death, the machinery of order, so meticulously constructed by the magistrates of Venice and the lords of Milan, possessed a fatal flaw. It was a machine made of stone and law, but it required human hands to turn the gears. A wall can stop a man, and a decree can close a port, but neither can bury a corpse, scrub a plague-stricken floor, or carry bread to a locked room. As the 14th century buckled under the weight of the great mortality, a new class of human being emerged from the wreckage. These were the professionals of the abyss, the doctors, the gravediggers, the watchmen, and the searchers. They were the people who lived where death lived, working in the spaces where the air was thickest with venom and the silence was loudest with grief. To the rest of society, these workers were the already dead. They were the expendables, recruited from the ranks of the desperate, the criminal, and the destitute. But the paradox of the plague was that the survival of the clean world now depended entirely on the unclean labor of those it despised. Order did not descend from the heavens. It was hauled through the streets on the back of a death cart. It was enforced by men who knew they would likely not see the next season. And it was documented by doctors who had long since traded their hope for a cold, clinical detachment. The most iconic and enigmatic of these figures was the plague doctor. While the popular image of the bird-like mask belongs to a later century, the role of the civic plague physician was born in the fires of the 1340s. These were not the prestigious university professors or the court physicians of the nobility. Those men had largely fled to the countryside. The plague doctors were often second-rate healers, young men looking for a name, or foreigners with nowhere else to go. They signed contracts with the city that were effectively suicide notes. In exchange for a high salary and citizenship, they agreed to live in the heart of the infection, to treat only the plague-stricken, and to never mingle with the healthy. The psychology of the plague doctor was one of radical, necessary detachment. To survive the mental toll of watching an entire population dissolve, they had to stop seeing patients as people and begin seeing them as data points. They moved through the pest houses with a heavy, rhythmic indifference. They did not offer the comfort of a bedside manner. They offered the bite of a lancet or the burn of a cauterizing iron. They were the first to witness the utter failure of medieval medicine, seeing every herbal poultice and every bloodletting fail to stem the tide. This failure birthed a grim fatalism. Many doctors became obsessed with the logic of the disease, performing clandestine autopsies in the dead of night to understand why the heart stopped or how the blood turned to ink. They were the lonely scouts of a new science, operating in a world where the only reward for their curiosity was a faster route to the grave. If the doctors were the eyes of the machine, the gravediggers the becca morti or pizzico morti were its hands. In the hierarchy of the plague, no one was more feared or more essential. These were men recruited from the prisons or the absolute lowest rungs of the urban poor. Their work was the most visceral and most dangerous. They were the men of the death carts, moving through the streets at night, their arrival heralded by the clanging of a handbell and the cry of "Bring out your dead." The psychology of the gravedigger was defined by a terrifying, nihilistic freedom. Knowing their lives were forfeit, many embraced a life of frantic, lawless success. Chroniclers described them drinking the wine of the dead, wearing the clothes of the fallen, and demanding exorbitant bribes from families who wanted their loved ones buried with a shred of dignity. They were the kings of the gutter. Yet, beneath this veneer of criminality, they were the ultimate servants of order. Without them, the city would have literally choked on its own dead. They were the ones who descended into the plague pits, layering the bodies like lasagne. As one Florentine writer described it, tamping down the earth over thousands of faces. They lived in a state of permanent contact with the physical reality of extinction, a reality that stripped away all social pretenses. To a gravedigger, a duke and a beggar were the same weight, the same smell, and the same cold plague. Working alongside them were the searchers of the dead, usually elderly women who were too poor to flee and too old to fear the future. Their task was the most invasive part of the state's surveillance. It was the searchers who entered the homes of the suspicious to strip the bodies and look for the telltale marks, the gavoccioli in the groin or the black spots on the chest. They were the gatekeepers of the statistics. Their word determined whether a house was nailed shut or left open. This gave these marginalized women an unprecedented and terrifying power over their neighbors. They moved through the city like ghosts, silent and observant, their hands reaching into the most private spaces of the dying to find the truth that the living were trying to hide. The guards and watchmen formed the final layer of this expendable workforce. These were the men stationed at the Red Cross doors, the jailers of the quarantined. Their psychological burden was perhaps the most complex. They were not fighting the disease. They were fighting the humans who tried to escape it. They spent their shifts listening to the screams of the families trapped inside, knowing that by keeping the door locked, they were participating in a slow execution. Some guards were moved to mercy, slipping food through windows or looking the other way as a child was lowered down a rope. Others were moved to a cold, bureaucratic cruelty, using their pikes to shellac anyone who sought the air. They were the physical embodiment of the state's fist, the men who turned the abstract concept of containment into a daily reality of iron and wood. Society viewed these workers with a potent mixture of gratitude and loathing. They were hailed as saviors of the Commonwealth in official documents, but in the streets, they were shunned. They were forbidden from entering churches, markets, or taverns. They were required to carry bells or wear distinctive clothing often red or yellow, so that the clean could avoid their path. They were the high-functioning outcasts of a broken world. This ostracization reinforced their internal culture of fatalism. They formed their own societies of the damned, eating together, drinking together, and burying their own in private ceremonies. They were a shadow civilization born from the plague, governed by the rules of the abyss. The reliance on these workers reveals the true foundation of medieval order. It was built on the sacrifice of the vulnerable, the survival of the elite in their country villas, and the safety of the magistrates in their stone halls were paid for by the lives of the thousands who stayed behind to do the dirty work. Order was not a static state. It was a process of constant, lethal labor. Every day that a city like Venice did not dissolve into total anarchy was a day purchased with the lungs of the purifiers and the backs of the corpse bearers. This period of the plague's reign saw a fundamental shift in the human spirit. The initial panic devoid of episode 1 had been replaced by something more durable and more dangerous, a system of disciplined death. The chaos had been organized. The fear had been channeled into a bureaucracy. The people had learned that they could live with the plague, provided they had enough expendables to keep the gears turning. As the workers moved through the midnight streets, their carts rattling over the cobblestones and their torches casting long, flickering shadows against the silent houses, they were doing more than just cleaning a city. They were demonstrating that humanity could adapt to any horror, provided it was willing to systematize it. They were the pioneers of a new kind of existence, where life was measured in shifts and sectors, and where the individual was secondary to the maintenance of the grid. But as the first great wave of the Black Death began to ebb, leaving behind a continent that was emptier, quieter, and colder, the survivors were left with a haunting question. They had survived by building walls, by imposing quarantines, and by sacrificing the already dead to save the clean. They had traded their compassion for a cold, administrative discipline. They had won the war against the randomness of death, but in doing so, they had transformed their world into a vast, regulated cage. The era of the void was over. The era of the grid had begun. The systems of fear that had defined the first months of the outbreak had matured into a permanent architecture of control. The survivors were no longer the panicked victims of a celestial wrath. They were the disciplined subjects of a biological state. But what happens when the plague returns to a world that is already under lock and key? What happens to the human soul when the temporary measures of the quarantine become the permanent foundations of society? As we move into the final chapter of our story, we must look beyond the walls and the carts to the legacy of the survivors. We must ask if the order they created was a shield that saved civilization or a shroud that stifled it. The workers of the abyss had held the line, but the world they saved was not the one they had known. It was a new world, a harder world. A world where the price of survival was the total surrender to the machine of control, a world that was finally ready to move from the chaos of the plague into the cold, bright light of the modern age. By the year 1350, the Black Death had ceased to be an event and had become an environment. It was no longer a sudden storm to be weathered, but a climate in which all human life had to be reorganized. As the dust of the first great collapse settled, a profound realization dawned upon the rulers of Europe and the Mediterranean. The plague was not merely a biological enemy, but a political one. It was a test of the very concept of the state. In the face of an invisible executioner, two distinct models of control emerged, each a desperate attempt to salvage the wreckage of civilization. One was built on the primitive instinct of fear-driven violence. The other was built on the sophisticated machinery of structured discipline. The struggle between these two models would determine not only who lived, but what kind of world would emerge from the pits. To understand the model of fear-driven violence, one must look at the cities that panicked from the top down. In many smaller principalities and loosely governed communes, the response to the plague was an explosion of arbitrary power. When the plague entered the gates, The local lord or the city council did not reach for a ledger. They reached for the sword. Their logic was simple. If death is spreading, any deviation from absolute stillness must be met with total force. This led to a reign of terror that was often more lethal than the disease itself. In these cities, the law became a series of spasms. One day, a decree might forbid the sale of meat. The next, it might command the burning of an entire quarter of the city. There was no consistency, no predictability, and no clear system of appeal. Punishment was swift and theatrical. In certain German towns and French provinces, the gallows were kept busy not with criminals, but with those who merely stepped out of their homes after sunset or were seen speaking to a stranger. This was the tyranny of the short-term fist. It was an attempt to shock the population into obedience, to use the threat of the rope to counteract the threat of the bubo. However, the history of 1348 to 1351 proves a devastating point. Rule through terror is an ineffective shield against a pandemic. In the cities where violence was the primary tool of control, the social fabric dissolved faster than in the cities where there was no rule at all. When the state becomes a monster, the citizens do not become disciplined, they become fugitives. In the terror-driven models, people did not report the sick. They hid them under the floorboards to avoid the state's arsonists. They did not follow curfews. They fled into the countryside, taking the infection with them and leaving the city's economy to rot in a single week. Fear-driven violence creates a hidden plague because the punishment for being ill or being associated with the ill was so total, often involving the loss of property, the burning of one's home, or the execution of family members. The populace entered a state of radical, defensive silence. Communication, the most vital tool in any crisis, was severed. The magistrates in these cities were flying blind, unaware of where the infection was truly concentrated until the stench of decay became unavoidable. By then, the state's authority was a hollow shell, presiding over a ghost town. These models collapsed because they relied on a psychological mechanism that the plague itself had already broken, the fear of death. You cannot effectively threaten a man with the gallows when his children are already dying of a fever. In contrast to this chaotic violence stood the model of structured discipline. This was the path taken by the great maritime republics and the organized city-states of northern Italy. This model did not rely on the theater of the gallows, but on the silent power of the grid. It was characterized by a shift from sovereign power, the power to kill, to disciplinary power, the power to organize, to count, and to monitor. In these cities, survival was treated as a logistical problem rather than a moral failing. Structured discipline required a new kind of obedience, one based not on terror, but on predictability. In Venice or Ragusa, a citizen knew exactly what would happen if they fell ill. There was a protocol. There were designated inspectors, designated transport boats, and designated islands. While these measures were often harsh, they were consistent. The state did not burn your house, it sequestered your goods. It did not hang you for a cough, it moved you to a facility where you were fed and, in theory, watched by a doctor. This predictability created a calculus of compliance. Human behavior under threat is not purely irrational, it is a negotiation between risks. In the disciplined cities, the risk of complying with the state was perceived as lower than the risk of hiding from it, because the state provided a framework, a system of food distribution, a method for burying the dead with a semblance of ritual, and a clear set of rules for movement. The citizenry remained an active part of the social body. They did not flee en masse, they stayed and participated in their own surveillance. The psychological analysis of these survivors reveals a startling truth. People will accept almost any level of restriction on their liberty if they believe the system is fair, consistent, and capable of producing an outcome. This is the birth of civic duty as a biological necessity. In the discipline model, obedience was not forced, it was engineered. The state stopped trying to kill the plague and started trying to manage the space in which the plague lived. They replaced the sword with the ledger, and the result was a dramatic increase in the resilience of the urban structure. The contrast between these two models also highlights the role of legitimacy. In the cities of violence, the rulers were seen as another form of the plague, an external force of destruction. In the cities of discipline, the health magistrates were seen as the last line of defense. This legitimacy allowed for the enforcement of the most radical tool of all, the census. For the first time, governments began to keep daily records of who lived where, who had died, and who was suspect. This was the ultimate form of control. The plague forced the state to know its people in a way that no medieval king had ever dreamed of. The individual became a cell in a larger organism. and their health became a matter of national security as the years progressed. The operations that consistently worked were those that combined this high-level administration with a ruthless but logical exclusion. It wasn't just about the fist or the grid, but the filter. The most successful operations were those that created a series of nested barriers. First, the port was filtered, then the neighborhood, then the house, and finally, the body itself. Each layer of filter was guarded not by an executioner, but by a clerk with a pen and a soldier with a clear set of standing orders. This structured discipline worked because it addressed the three great killers of the 14th century: proximity, movement, and the breakdown of information. By controlling proximity through the 40-day quarantine, the state slowed the biological clock. By controlling movement through health passes and gated districts, the state contained the spread. And by controlling information through mandatory reporting and centralized death records, the state regained the initiative. The cities that survived and thrived in the aftermath of the Black Death were the ones that mastered this cold order. They proved that in the face of absolute chaos, the only thing more powerful than the fear of death is the structure of a system. They traded the erratic, theatrical violence of the medieval past for the silent, bureaucratic persistence of the modern future. As the sun began to rise on a Europe that had lost nearly half its population, the survivors looked around and realized that the world had changed. The era of the knight and the priest was being eclipsed by the era of the magistrate and the doctor. The systems of fear had failed, but the systems of discipline had held. The order that had been forged in the fire of the plague was not a temporary measure. It was the foundation of a new kind of civilization, a civilization that prioritized survival over glory and control over freedom. But what were the specific mechanics of this victory? What were the day-to-day operations that allowed a city to breathe while the rest of the world suffocated? As we look back from our modern vantage point, we see that the most effective strategies were not the ones that sought to cure the sick, but the ones that sought to categorize the living. The victory over the plague was a victory of administration. It was a victory of the clock, the wall, and the list. And so, we must look finally at the operations that consistently worked the blueprint for survival. That would be handed down through the centuries. These were the operations that recognized that the only way to manage a catastrophe is to turn it into a routine. They were the operations of the cordon sanitaire, the lazaretto, and the health board, the triple pillars of a new world order that was finally emerging from the darkness. The era of the void had been conquered by the era of the system, and the survivors were now the architects of a world where safety was the ultimate law, and discipline was the only way to stay alive. In the final accounting, it was not the strongest who survived, nor the most pious, but the most organized, and as the plague receded, it left behind a world that was no longer a collection of people, but a collection of managed lives, waiting for the next operation to begin. The transition from the chaos of 1347 to the organized resilience of the late 14th century was marked by a fundamental realization: the plague could not be prayed away, but it could be managed through the ruthless application of logistical systems. As the initial hysteria receded, the survivors were no longer those who sought divine intervention, but those who mastered the mechanical arts of isolation, tracking, and destruction. This was the era of the operations that worked, a period where the survival of a city-state depended less on its theology and more on its ability to treat its population as a series of data points in a landscape of infection. The first and most effective system was the radical isolation of the infected unit. In the early days of the Black Death, isolation had been a frantic, individual choice of family fleeing to the woods. By the height of the second and third waves, it had become a state-mandated science. The logic moved from the external wall to the internal room. The most successful cities realized that the plague moved through the breath and the touch of those closest to us. Therefore, the state's primary operation was the severing of the domestic bond. When an infection was confirmed, the operation of the house began. It was not enough to merely lock the door. The state had to ensure that the house became a self-contained biological prison. In Milan and Venice, this involved the systematic boarding of windows and the stationing of a permanent guard, whose only job was to prevent the leakage of people. This system was successful because it attacked the plague's primary vector, human density. By trapping the infection within a stone box, the authorities effectively sacrificed the family to save the street. It was a cold, empirical victory. Across Europe, the records show that in districts where shutting up was enforced within 24 hours of the first symptom, the mortality rate of the surrounding neighborhood dropped by as much as 70%. It was the victory of the cell over the crowd. But isolation required more than just locks. It required the tracking of movement. The second operation that consistently saved lives was the creation of the world's first internal passport system, the Feed de Sanita, or Health Pass. In the pre-plague world, a man could travel from town to town with relative ease. After 1348, movement was treated as a privilege granted by the state. To move from Florence to Siena, or even from one parish to another, a survivor had to carry a document, signed by a health magistrate certifying that they had come from a clean place and had not touched a suspect body. This was the birth of the bureaucracy of the body. The state began to track every citizen's history of contact. If you were found on a road without your boleta, you were not just a traveler. You were a biohazard. You were in prison, or worse, executed on the spot. This operation succeeded because it turned the vast, unmanaged movement of the medieval world into a controlled, visible stream. It allowed the state to see the plague before it arrived. By tracking who moved where, the authorities could map the spread of the disease in real time, closing gates and burning bridges weeks before the first bubo appeared. Discipline had replaced luck. The third practical system focused on the material world, the destruction of possessions. One of the most terrifying observations made by the survivors was that the plague seemed to live in the things the dead left behind. They didn't know about the plague-carrying fleas nesting in the wool of a dead man's cloak, but they saw the pattern. Those who took the clothes of the dead died shortly after. This led to the operation of the pyre. In the disciplined cities, the state seized the property of the plague dead. They did not store it, and they did not redistribute it. They burned it. Massive fires were lit in the public squares, fueled by silk, wool, straw, and furniture. This was a psychological and economic trauma for a world where property was the only measure of a man's worth. But it was a biological necessity. By burning the fomites, the inanimate carriers of the disease, the state was cleaning the environment of the invisible enemy. This was successful because it addressed the reservoir of the plague. Cities that implemented the total burning of a victim's bedding and clothing within hours of their death saw their infection cycles break significantly faster than those that allowed the poor to scavenge from the dead. The final and most socially transformative operation was the total restriction of gatherings. The medieval world was a world of the we, of the mass, the market, and the guild. The plague made the we lethal. The survivors were the ones who had the discipline to stay alone. The most successful city-states banned every form of public assembly. They closed the churches, silenced the markets, and forbade the traditional funeral processions that had been the cornerstone of Christian life. For centuries, this was the death of the collective. In London and Marseille, even groups of more than 3 people were dispersed by armed guards. The state realized that every gathering was an opportunity for the plague to leap from one host to another. By enforcing a silence across the city, they were starving the disease of its fuel. This required a profound psychological shift. People had to learn to find meaning in their own isolation. They had to accept that their presence at a funeral was an act of violence against the living. The success of this method across diverse regions, from the ports of the Levant to the villages of Scandinavia, proved that the biological reality of the plague was indifferent to culture or belief. It only cared about proximity. Why did these methods succeed where prayer and medicine failed? Because they were based on observation rather than tradition. The survivors were the first empiricists of the state. They noticed that the pious monk who held the hand of the dying died, while the cynical guard who stood 10 feet away lived. They noticed that the village that burned its trash stayed healthy, while the village that prayed in a crowded cathedral was wiped out. They chose discipline over belief. They chose the operation over the miracle. This shift had a profound impact on the psychology of the survivor. To live through the plague was to witness the total irrelevance of medieval virtue. The good died, and the discipline lived. This birthed a new, secular morality, the morality of the system. The hero was no longer the martyr. The hero was the magistrate who kept the ledger clean and the gates closed. Compliance with the health board became the new form of righteousness. As the plague years ground on, these practical systems began to reshape the very structure of human power. The feudal lord, whose power was based on land and oaths of loyalty, found himself powerless against a biological threat. The new power belonged to the technocrats of survival, the men who controlled the health passes, the quarantines, and the death carts. The state was no longer a collection of personal relationships. It was becoming an administrative machine designed for the preservation of biological life. The operations that worked isolation, tracking, burning, and the suppression of the crowd did more than just save bodies. They created a new kind of citizen, one who was tracked, monitored, and conditioned to obey the mandates of the state in the name of safety. The order that had been forged in the fire of the 1340s was not a temporary measure. It was the blueprint for the modern era. As Part 8 concludes, we see that the chaos of the void has been fully conquered by the grid. The world has been reorganized into a series of managed spaces, but this victory came at a price. By prioritizing discipline over belief and distance over community, the survivors had saved their lives, but they had fundamentally altered what it meant to be human. They had entered the plague as members of a spiritual community. They were emerging as subjects of a biological state. The legacy of these operations would be felt for centuries. The power structures of Europe had been permanently tilted away from the church and the castle, toward the bureau and the hospital. The survivors were now the masters of a new, harder reality, a world where survival was the ultimate law, and where the order of the machine was the only thing standing between humanity and the abyss. The era of the survivor state had arrived, and with it, the birth of a world that would never again prioritize the we over the system. As the great fires of the plague pits finally smoldered into ash, and the tolling of the bells grew infrequent, a strange and hollow silence settled over Europe. The storm had passed, but the landscape it left behind was unrecognizable. Nearly half the population was gone, and with them, the old justifications for how the world was run had vanished into the earth. This was the era of the Great Inheritance. The Black Death had acted as a radical, violent auditor of human society, and the survivors were left to divide the spoils of an apocalypse. In this final chapter of the Great Mortality, we see that the most enduring legacy of the plague was not the medical advancement it sparked, but the total redistribution of power. Survival had become the only true form of legitimacy. To understand the shift in power, one must look at the geography of the vacant. In 1350, Europe was a continent of widowlands. Millions of acres of fertile soil, once tilled by a desperate and overpopulated peasantry, now lay fallow. The manor houses of the nobility were often empty, their lineages extinguished in a single week. For the first time in 1,000 years, the supply of land exceeded the supply of people. This inverted the fundamental logic of the medieval world. In the pre-plague era, people were cheap and land was dear. After the plague, land was cheap and people were priceless. The first to seize this power were the survivors of the lower classes. The peasant who had spent his life in debt to a lord now found himself in a position of unprecedented leverage. With no one left to harvest the grain or shear the sheep, the remaining laborers realized they possessed a new, biological form of capital, their own existence. They began to demand higher wages, better conditions, and the right to move freely. When the lords attempted to use the old laws of feudalism to force them back into the mud, the peasants simply walked away. They moved to the next village or the next city, where desperate employers were willing to pay in gold rather than in promises of protection. This was the death knell of the feudal system. The order of the knight and the serf had been based on a scarcity of opportunity. The plague had created an abundance of it. As the peasants grew wealthier, they began to dress in the clothes of the fallen nobility and eat the white bread that had once been reserved for the elite. They were inheriting not just the land, but the lifestyle of their former masters. This was not a revolution of ideas, it was a revolution of vacancy. The survivors were moving into the empty spaces left by the dead, and in doing so, they were dismantling the hierarchies of birthright. Among the urban elite, a similar redistribution was occurring. The merchant families who had survived the quarantines of Venice, Genoa, and London found themselves in possession of massive, concentrated fortunes. Inheritances that would have been split among 10 children were now concentrated in the hands of 1 or 2. This unnatural wealth accumulation fueled the rise of a new kind of power, the power of liquid capital. These survivors did not care about the ancient titles of the nobility. They cared about the efficiency of the system. They used their wealth to fund the very health boards and administrative grids that had saved them. They were the new aristocracy of the system, men whose authority came not from God or blood, but from their ability to survive and manage the crisis. Survival became the new basis for political legitimacy. In the years following the outbreak, the rulers who had stayed and imposed Order the Viscontis of Milan, the Great Council of Venice, found their power significantly enhanced. The population, though traumatized, looked to these architects of the wall with a new kind of respect. They had proven that the state could provide something that the church could not, a tomorrow. This led to a hardening of institutional power. The temporary measures of the plague, the checkpoints, the tracking of movement, the censorship of information became permanent features of governance. The survivor state was born. a government whose primary mandate was the biological security of its borders. But this redistribution of power had a darker side. As the survivors grew wealthier and more powerful, the memory of the void began to fade, replaced by a cold, opportunistic cynicism. The order they built was more efficient, but it was also more heartless. The state had learned that its citizens were replaceable parts in a machine of survival. The individual was no longer a soul to be saved, but a body to be managed. The great lesson of the plague, that we are all equal in the face of death, was quickly forgotten in the rush to consolidate the new wealth. The dance macabre was moved from the church walls to the counting houses. What, then, did humanity truly learn as we look back across the centuries? The answer is hauntingly ambiguous. We learned how to build walls. We learned how to track each other. We learned how to turn a catastrophe into a bureaucracy. We learned that discipline is more effective than prayer. But we failed to learn the lesson of the void, the lesson that our civilizations are fragile veneers over a vast, indifferent silence. We failed to learn that the order we build is only as strong as the people we are willing to sacrifice to maintain it. The survivors of 1348 did not create a better world. They created a more organized one. They traded the chaos of the medieval spirit for the cold security of the modern state. They inherited the earth, but they filled it with fences. They looked into the abyss, and instead of finding humility, they found a blueprint for control. The Black Death was the fire that forged the modern world. It broke the old bonds of the soul and replaced them with the new bonds of the system. It taught us that we can survive anything, provided we are willing to give up our freedom and our neighbors to do it. As the final survivors of that era passed away, they had left behind a world that was richer, emptier, and far more dangerous. They had won the war against the plague, but they had lost the world they were trying to save. The story of the plague survivors is the story of how humanity survives, by becoming like the very thing that threatens it, cold, persistent, and indifferent to the individual. The order they left behind is the world we still inhabit, a world of grids, filters, and walls. And as we look at the red crosses fading on the old doors of history, we are left with a final, chilling question. In the next great silence, in the next dark winter, will we be the ones who leave? The ones who wall themselves in, or the ones who hold the pen and decide who is clean and who is dead? The plague never truly left us. It just taught us how to live within its shadow. And in that shadow, we are all survivors, waiting for the bells to start tolling once again. The Black Death did not end. It merely became the infrastructure of the world. As the 14th century surrendered to the 15th, and the 15th to the modern age, the specific biology of the pestilence may have ebbed and flowed, but the systems humanity built to withstand it never truly receded. We often imagine history as a series of progressive steps, away from the darkness of the medieval past, yet in the realm of survival. We are still living in the shadow of the year 1348. The methods forged in the desperate, blood-soaked streets of Milan and Venice, the quarantines, the health passes, the surveillance of the body did not disappear because they were temporary measures. They stayed because they were the first tools that actually worked. They were the discovery of a new kind of power, a biological power that proved more durable than crowns or cathedrals. This is the final, haunting realization of the survivor's story. That order, once introduced to combat chaos, never surrenders its territory. To understand why these methods never disappeared, we must look at the psychological DNA of the human species. When faced with an invisible threat, whether it is a flea-borne bacterium, a modern virus, or an abstract terror, humanity as default response is not a leap of faith or a search for consensus. It is a retreat into the architecture of the plague. We return with a terrifying, rhythmic instinct to the cordon sanitaire. The wall is our oldest and most trusted friend. In every crisis of the modern era, the first instinct of the state is to freeze movement, to categorize the population into the clean and the unclean, and to treat the neighbor as a vector of infection. This is the legacy of the 14th century magistrate. We have simply traded the red cross on the door for a digital code on a screen. The logic remains identical. The safety of the collective is bought through the absolute control of the individual as physical space. The persistence of these methods lies in their terrifying efficiency. Before the plague, power was theatrical and sporadic. A king ruled by the display of his majesty. His power was felt only when he was present. But the plague forced the birth of an administrative power that was invisible and constant. The health boards that emerged in the Renaissance did not go away when the plague pits were covered. They expanded. They became the departments of public health, the census bureaus, and the border controls of the modern state. The order of the grid proved too useful for rulers to abandon. It allowed the state to know its people where they slept, who they spoke to, and whether they were a productive or hazardous element of society. The plague taught the state how to count, and once a state begins to count its people, it never stops. This is the transition from sovereign power to biopower. In the medieval world, the king had the power to take life. In the post-plague world, the state took on the power to manage life. This shift is the foundation of our modern world. We live in a civilization that is obsessed with the management of risk. We have internalized the discipline of the plague worker. We accept the tracking of our movements, the monitoring of our health, and the restriction of our gatherings, because we have been conditioned for 7 centuries to believe that these are the only things standing between us and the void. We are the children of the survivors, and we have inherited their cold, pragmatic fear. But the cost of this inheritance is a permanent alteration of the human social contract. The order that saves us is also the order that isolates us. By embracing the strategy of distance, we have fundamentally weakened the bonds of the we. The medieval community was shattered by the plague, and it was replaced by a collection of managed individuals. We see this in the way we respond to every modern emergency. Our first instinct is to withdraw, to judge, and to exclude. The other is always a potential source of miasma. This is the psychological scar of the Black Death, a deep-seated suspicion of human intimacy. We have survived, but we have done so by making ourselves harder, more closed, and more dependent on the state to mediate our interactions with one another. The most haunting aspect of this conclusion is the realization that control is a one-way street. History shows that the powers granted to the state during a crisis, the powers of quarantine, surveillance, and movement restriction, are almost never fully returned. They are stored in a legal and administrative reserve, waiting for the next invisible threat to justify their reactivation. The Red Cross never truly fades, it just becomes invisible, waiting for the brush of the next emergency to bring it back to the surface. We live in a state of permanent potential quarantine. The grid is always there, beneath the surface of our free society, ready to be tightened at a moment's notice. Why did these methods never disappear? Because they represent the ultimate human compromise. We have traded the terrifying, random freedom of the void for the safe, predictable cage of the order. We have decided that the preservation of biological life is the highest possible good, more important than the preservation of liberty, community, or even the soul. The survivors of the 1340s made a bet with the future. They bet that humanity would prefer to be policed and alive than free and dead, and every generation since has confirmed that they were right as we look at our modern world with its high-speed connections and its globalized trade. We like to think we are different from the people who fled into the Tuscan hills or walled up their neighbors in Milan. But when the lights flicker and the threat becomes invisible once more, we see the masks go on, the borders close, and the tracking systems activate. We see the same fear, the same exclusion, and the same desperate reliance on authority. We are not as modern as we think. We are still the survivors of the Black Death, clutching our health passes and staring at our neighbors with suspicion. Survival has a cost. The cost is the loss of a world where we were not data points, where our movements were not tracked, and where our breath was not a matter of state security. We have built a civilization that is a magnificent, air-conditioned lazaretto, a place of safety, but also a place of total, unblinking surveillance. We have survived the plague, wave after wave, century after century, but we must ask ourselves what is left of us after 700 years of operations. The order remains, the control remains, the survival remains, but the ghost of the medieval city is still there, beneath the steel and glass of our modern capitals. It is the ghost of the father who fled from his son, the ghost of the magistrate who bricked up the door, and the ghost of the gravedigger who sang in the pit. They are our ancestors, and their choices are our laws. In the final accounting, the story of the plague survivors is not a story of triumph. It is a story of a long, slow surrender. We have conquered the randomness of death, but we have done so by inviting the order of the machine into every corner of our lives. We are safe, we are disciplined, and we are alone. And as the bells of history continue to toll, reminding us of the fragility of our systems, we realize the final dark truth of our journey, that once you invite the state to guard your door, against the shadow the state stays at the door forever. Control never leaves once it has been introduced, because there is always another shadow, another threat, and another reason to keep the gate closed. We have survived the plague, but we are still living in the quarantine, and perhaps, in the silence of our managed world, We always will be.